There are ways of communicating in such a way that we know that saying things a certain way is effective, that saying things a certain way lands and resonates with our structure when it's a certain, when the structure is a certain way, certain descriptions, certain words land and have an impact. And so teachings will often appreciate that that's the case and therefore use those approaches. It's part of the skillful means of a teaching. And there are frameworks that, when delivered with a consistency, also serve a very important role. And so they are utilized in teachings. It's also fair to say that some teachings won't use a framework because a framework can tend to be approaching it from maybe a more structured point of view, and so some teachings appreciate that structure is sort of part of the historic problem, and so let's leave it out of the equation. And sometimes when we're looking at what to say, we can find a bit of a conundrum between the realization that a framework and certain ways of saying it have a very useful effect and a powerful effect. And there's also a desire sometimes to say things such that they have less poetic license in them. And it's the poetic license sometimes that adds some of the punch. But the poetic license also means it's strictly not as accurate as it could be. Now, accuracy is not the all-important thing. So there's payoffs and costs in doing it one way or the other. And so I don't know which way to take it today. I'll give you an example. We could say your true nature is incapable of suffering. What you are, what you really are, is free from suffering. It's your birthright to be at peace in life. We've forgotten what we really are. There has been a divine hypnosis placed upon us, and that divine hypnosis has created this misunderstanding of who we are, a false sense of self. And the journey is simply about returning to our true nature that is free of suffering. So the hypnosis, the false sense of self, has meant that we're forced to suffer in life. And a return to self, a return to the true nature, to the true self, is very much available. And that means life free of suffering is very much available. Now, this is a very important message that we need to hear. What it's saying, in other words, another way of saying it, is that suffering, when it is present, is destined to be there in that moment because it's there. But it's based on a misunderstanding of life, a misunderstanding of who you are, a false sense of self which relates to life from the perspective that has been set up. And at any point in time, that false sense of self can dissolve because it's seen to be inaccurate, and the suffering dissolves with it because it too is inaccurate. If there is a misunderstanding, then only misunderstanding can stem from misunderstanding. So in a way, this is very good news, that we have misunderstood what we really are. And so suffering is a result of that misunderstanding. And spiritual teachings are reminding us of what we truly are, attempting to dissolve the misunderstanding so that the suffering, which is misunderstanding, dissolves. So hearing and understanding that suffering, as common as it is, as standard as it is, it's a color that life has inserted into the masterpiece of life very regularly. It's one of life's favorite colors that has been used in painting, the painting of life. So it's normal for there to be suffering. However, maybe we can come to understand that it's not natural. What I mean by natural, meaning it's not an output of our true nature. And so when the suffering, which is this color in life, that life has used a lot of, is there, hopefully we can relate to it as there, as understandable, but not as truth. I think I have a sense that from a fairly young age, intuitively or automatically, if I found myself too uncomfortable with something that was going on, at a certain point in time when the uncomfortableness reached a certain intensity, and I don't think it needed to be that much for me looking back, something would kick in and say, this is because of the way you are looking at the situation. So I don't know if at that time I had the terminology in my own thinking that said this is about your attitude to life. But I might not have had the terminology, but I think I understood that it was about being involved, about feeling myself heavily correlated to the circumstance that was happening. And so a movement would kick in of how can I see this differently? How can I let go of seeing this as important? And I suppose that's grace. I don't know why that was obvious to me. The important part is it becomes obvious to us at some point, and that's exactly what is being suggested here, that suffering is a result of a misunderstanding of who we are, and that misunderstanding of who we are takes life very personally, takes circumstance as being a very, very relevant topic to my completeness. And if we really were what we believe ourselves to be, something that requires life to one day cooperate with us in order for us to feel okay. If that's what we were, then circumstance would be important, because every time circumstance goes wrong, it would be an attack on who I am. But if it turns out that we aren't that sort of entity, if it turns out that we are actually an entity that in and of itself already is complete, and that we just need to return home to that place. We just need to find a way to connect to the part of ourself that is self-confirming and complete, the part of ourself that can let go of a circumstance because it knows it isn't defined by outcomes. So really it's a fantastic message, a wonderful message. It's a reminder, it's a pointer to return home. And for some strange reason, humanity by and large hasn't really been interested in listening to that message. I say strange from one perspective, and then from another perspective it's very understandable. From the point of view of seeing the human being as including this sense of self that is convinced that it requires to receive things, to get things, then that sense of self is very willing to engage in religion or spirituality, but will see that sense of self engaging in religion or spirituality in a way that it is essentially trying to bribe or, pray, beg, do things in order to win favor of the God in the religion, the God that is all powerful and can give you everlasting life, can give you entry into paradise, can create miracles and give you what it is that you may want here on earth. And so we see people who will, spend their life prostrating across vast lengths of land because the belief system is that if I do this, then I have shown my dedication beyond what is normal, and I'm sure to get rewarded for this. So the vast percentage of humanity is either interested in pursuing more through their own capacities, and for those that find themselves in a life situation where their own capacities can't deliver them more than they already have, then they will quite happily devote themselves to God, who maybe magically will give them more. And so the spiritual seeking message that I'm talking about here, which is, life free of suffering, is strange, well, not so strangely, but isn't received as something that precious. Because it doesn't look like the thing that the psychological self is focused on. So it says, oh yeah, I'll get to that. Once I've finished my project of getting more, then that seems like a reasonable, maybe reasonable thing to put some energy in, but definitely not before I get more. And so that movement for more is actually part of the suffering dynamic. It's part of the I am not complete, so I need more belief system. It is part of the belief system that will turn into expectation. It is part of the belief system that will feel shame when we don't manage to achieve better than everyone else. It is part of the belief system that will blame the other and turn into hatred for the other for whatever part they played in not allowing us to get more. It's part of what will turn into worry and anxiety for how the future might turn out, a future that is probably not always going to cooperate with me getting more. And the getting more is not limited to more material stuff either. That's in part that, but really I think when we look at it, there's a part of us deep down in the unconscious that is looking to get more material things just so we are theoretically more lovable. Almost like part of the natural selection process. You know, if you're on the male side of things and you're strong and a good reproducer, you're higher up on the evolutionary scale, and therefore you're going to be sought out by the females. And so in human terms, gaining more materially, whether it's physical strength and therefore looking better than the rest, whether it's material wealth or intellectual prowess, fame, success, may all just be a way of getting love, a strategy to be more lovable. So deep down, the seeking, the craving, the desire is for love from the other. And non-love comes in the form of people getting angry at you, people not respecting you, not being truthful to you, all the things that someone can do, not listening to you, not accepting you, not understanding you, all of not agreeing with you. Anything that someone does that isn't saying, yes, you are the best, is essentially received as the opposite of love. And whenever we are shown that we are considered to be the best or one of the best or pretty good, then we see that as love. So it isn't, when I say we're craving love from the other, we're really craving pleasure that we might think is, or we might call it love, but really we just want appreciation. And I would suggest that that stems from that movement, that deeply ingrained urge, stems from a deeply ingrained sense that we are not quite good enough, we are not complete. We are worthy of being abandoned, we are not worthy of being loved, we are not worthy of getting good things. And that's part of the human development. I'd say that in my terms could refer to, or is my interpretation is that original sin, which is sometimes referred to in religions, refers to sort of something that we can't avoid. It's part of our false sense of self. So you could say, forgetting what I said earlier on, someone could say it's part of your nature as a human being to feel not good enough. Now, I would say that's not part of your true nature, but rather part of the false sense of self that gets put in place automatically without us having a choice or an option. It gets put in place, and at the root of that false sense of self, there is this sense of incompleteness and this sense of being worthy of being abandoned for not being good enough. So it's an underlying theme. And in some people, that underlying theme will present itself as a sense of shame, really not feeling good enough and feeling guilty, never feeling like you've done enough. And especially if your destiny is to not be particularly successful or stand out from the crowd, then that will be food for this feeling of shame to prey on or to feed on. And for some other people, that sense of shame will express differently, not as a sense of insecurity and unworthiness, which is how it presents for some people. But we clearly see there are people in life that are very confident and actually the opposite, you could say, proud and arrogant. And that pride and arrogance, I say, is still linked to a deeply ingrained sense of not worthiness, because that is what is making them seek the approval. And it just so happens that their makeup, their genes and up-to-date conditioning, their destiny is such that they're out there at the front of the pack getting results. And so then that too, those results, becomes food for the sense of shame to take hold of, but not in the same way. So the sense of shame says, you don't feel good enough, go out and prove that you are good enough. And so the ones that can get the success are saying, yes, look what I've achieved. Tell me I'm good enough, so that I can then get rid of this feeling of not being good enough. So if the feeling of not being good enough, which is an unconscious essence of the false sense of self, if that wasn't there, then this urge to sort of fill in a gap would fall away. So we can start to see that this urge to get more is being driven by a sense of lack. And if the sense of lack falls away, the urge to go out and get more may actually fall away, which really says that the going out to get more may not be the solution. It may seem like the solution because there's a sense of lack, and so the sense of lack says go and get rid of this sense of lack by proving it wrong or getting stuff to fill in the hole. But what if the sense of lack is a belief that can dissolve rather than an actual deficiency that needs to be fulfilled or needs to be overcome? And if that's the case, then the actual solution is not the gaining of love, but the falling away of the sense of I need love. And the falling away of that sense that I need love means essentially you are not demanding anywhere near as much from life and from society. You're no longer going to be asking the other to be different to give you what you think you need. And believe it or not, when that's our modus operandi, when we go out in life, we are essentially being very needy on life and on the other, and we are demanding that the other do what we want rather than allowing them to be as they are. So the falling away of this sense of needing approval and love and outcomes in life is a great relief, primarily for oneself. It's like, oh, what a relief. I thought I needed to tick off all of these things in order to be able to start living well, whereas in fact, it's the dissolving of the to-do list that allows us to feel well. So we go, oh, what a relief. I get to the finish line without even starting. So half of the error is believing that there is a finish line and that we need to start. So as soon as we are on our way towards the finish line, we're actually moving away from the finish line, which we're already at. if only the false sense of self, with all of its demands on life, would fall away. Now, what is the false sense of self? The false sense of self is something that is built into our structure. The human being is a very complex entity, a biological entity. And as part of the biological entity, there is a psychological component. So the human is a biological instrument with a psychological component to that biological instrument. And the psychological sense of self, the false sense of self, is part of this psychological aspect of the very complex biological human instrument. And that biological human instrument is essentially a product of life. We are a product of life. Contrary to popular belief, your mother and father didn't really make you. They were just instruments through which the sperm and the egg came together. The growing process happened in spite of your parents. They just had to wait. Once the sperm and egg came together, it initiated a blueprint that had to grow. And if it's in the right environment, it grows according to the blueprint and the environment it's in. And then when it pops out of the growing environment, it's into another growing environment. And it continues to be impacted by the environment it's in. And it continues to grow, developing an intellect and emotions and the capacity to think and to talk and to act and to feel and respond. So everything that you know yourself as a human being is a result of this amazing growing process of an organism that is very complex, is biological with emotional and psychological aspects, and awareness, and a sense of self. So all of that is the human experience. And a very significant component, and notice I'm suggesting it's a component of the human being, is this psychological sense of self that gets put in place, and it feels like it develops such that it says what I am is X, Y, and Z, very particular to each human being, common in general principle, but in its unique form, but with some common, very common traits. And in general terms, we can say the core of this psychological self is to be identified with the body and everything that happens in and through the body, saying that that is who I am. And furthermore, I am not only this, but I am the one that is in control of myself and in control of everything that happens through me and in control of the consequences. So that psychological idea of ourself creates a psychological sense of self. Now, it's essentially a mental construct, a belief system, a mental psychological entity, but how that is experienced is something quite tangible, which we all know. It's especially in relation to the uncomfortableness that we feel when things get taken away from us. When our sense of worthiness is challenged because someone says you haven't done a good enough job, I'm choosing someone else over you, We judge ourselves in relation to the others, so we compare ourselves and we say, well, actually, if I were them, I would choose someone else over me. And so that sense of self is particularly uncomfortable. It has an uncomfortableness to it, and it's based on this belief that I am the doer. I am primarily a physical entity. The strange thing is the psychological identity doesn't see any other aspects other than the physical and to some extent the emotion, and it believes itself to need things that it hopefully will get over time in order to one day feel complete and feel comfortable in life. And those ideas are ideas about ourself that are out of line with our true nature. So that's what I meant by before. We've forgotten what we really are. So a psychological identity has been formed that is taking center stage. While it's there, it has to take center stage. And so the true nature gets overlooked. It might be in the back, waiting patiently, saying, well, it seems like it's time for the psychological self to be on the center of the stage. And when the psychological self is on the center of the stage, it feels like it is the thing that is interacting with life, and it's generally in resistance to life. It's generally finding life to be not supportive of itself. So it's not in harmony with what happens in the flow of life. And that means an uncomfortableness, a sense of a lack of fulfillment, a lack of contentment, a lack of meaning, and a drive to try and fix this lack of fulfillment, lack of contentment, lack of meaning. And it does it by trying to seek, trying to gain, trying to find a mission or a purpose, a passion, a soulmate, an invention. It wants to create art so that it can create something that it can be impressed with, and therefore impressed about itself and feel good about itself. And all of that can fall away if all those desires that we have, when they're motivated to try and make ourselves feel better as a proof I am good enough, they're not actually real creativity. They're a desire for creativity that we will then be able to use to feel better than ourselves. And if that's the case, and that identity falls away, we'll say, I'm not interested in doing those things, because we'll see that they were being hoped for and craved for by the psychological self. Now, that doesn't mean that we won't do art. It means we won't do it from the same place. It doesn't mean that we won't have projects. It just means we won't do them from the same place of hoping that the project will give us something that we currently don't have. So that means our attachment to outcome falls away. And then we may or may not create projects or be creative, depending on whether that is a natural movement that comes up as part of our destiny. Because the motivation of attachment won't be there. We have to do something in life. So when I say we may or may not have projects or be creative, it means we might have an interest to start up a business and see if it's successful, but we might find that we're very interested in spending all the days just walking in the forest, or lounging on a park bench, if your circumstance allows that. It might very well be that you still need to engage in going to work in order to get enough money to pay for your food and your shelter and your family's food and shelter. However, the movement will then be a much more natural movement that's not inspired and by this sense of what is missing. Let me try and get this, or let me try and do that, and let me squeeze this in. It becomes a much more natural movement. And more importantly, we find that whatever we're doing, even if it's not the things that we are our favorite, but we just have to do them because of circumstance, like maybe going to work for 8 hours a day, it won't be infused with a feeling of complaint, a feeling of regret towards the past, and a feeling of, I wish life wasn't this way and that I, was as lucky as my neighbor or whatever. That grey color, which is an uncomfortableness with life, falls away. You say, well, obviously I have to, we're in a system of life where you have to pay for your food and you have to pay for your shelter. And so it makes sense that I have to go to work. It's not optional or nothing to complain about. It's just what I have to do. Otherwise I won't have food, and that would be far more of a problem. So while the psychological identity that sees itself as separate and independent and autonomous from the rest of life, needing things that the others can take away in order to be complete, for as long as that identity is in place, it isn't an option to feel anything other than what that identity feels. So the notion of non-doership means an understanding, an attitude towards, firstly, the flow of life, which refers to the circumstance, which is either pleasurable or painful, depending on whether it's in line with the body's biological preferences. An attitude to that flow of life that says, the flow of life is largely out of my control. In fact, totally out of my control. And even my attitude to the flow of life. So if I have an attitude that's saying, I wish that I was born into a different family, right? If that is your attitude, a different family in a different circumstance, and I wish that my life wasn't like this, then that too is a happening according to destiny, according to God's will. And so if the attitude of personal doership starts to fall away, then eventually we won't have that attitude towards life, because we'll realize, what's this wish? I wish I was born into another family. What a ridiculous wish to have. If we wish it because we think it was possible, I guess, when we see the futility of that wish, when we see that that is just an attitudinal resistance to what is, and we understand that that attitudinal resistance to what is our suffering, and that there's no way that you could have been born into a different family in a different location, because that means that would just be a different life. Now, it's understandable when life has formed us a certain way that we have that wish. It just means that we're looking at life in a way that seems to validate the wish as being something that we should spend time wishing, which really is a resistance, a non-harmony with life, a non-harmony with ourselves. And yet if we're a certain way, that way clearly supports the thinking that makes sense, because a lot of people are forced to function that way. As the recognition of non-doership starts setting in, then that type of thinking will be seen as being an attitude towards life that is really serving one purpose, and that is to make one's life even more uncomfortable on the level of the sense of self, which is adding this much bigger load of guilt and blame and pride and worry and expectation on top of the circumstance you find yourself in. And it's that attitudinal load of guilt and blame and pride and worry and expectation that really makes life unacceptable. Can you imagine the human being that is there wishing that their life circumstance was different? And imagine if their attitude suddenly gets sucked out of them and they find themselves being with life. That the story, the complaint, which was this attitudinal movement towards life, which they were forced to have, which makes life so uncomfortable, is just taken away. Now they're quiet. They won't know themselves if that happens in an instant. And so when certain awakenings happen, or certain spiritual experiences happen, it can be like that, where someone has been designed in such a way that the uncomfortableness, the attitude with life is sort of there as a consistent component in one's life experience. There's a circumstance and there's this heavy attitude of guilt, blame, pride, worry and anxiety, expectation and attachment to outcome. And under all of those headings, there are many subheadings of different ways of feeling, which are really different attitudes to life. So for example, under shame or guilt and shame, we can have a sense of insecurity, a sense of lack of self-worth. I'm not good enough. It's under guilt. I'm not good enough. I didn't do that well enough. I wasn't a good enough daughter or son or friend or neighbor or stranger. And so there's a sense of feeling guilty for not having done something that we should have done. And so a sense of insecurity or lack of self-worth is simply a deeply ingrained part of our sense of self that fits under the shame and guilt category. And then blame can have, mild irritation and blame towards someone for having finished all the milk in the fridge and having a story about that extends horizontally in time. There can be jealousy, there can be envy, there's judgment where you judge another person for being different to how you are, and essentially have a sense of superiority towards them, or make them look at them as inferior. So under each of these categories of the sense of self, there are lots of subcategories that we have to become familiar with. Now, we become familiar with those as we feel them, as we start to understand. The uncomfortableness is an attitude towards life, an attitude towards oneself and the other. And the attitude is an attitude based on the belief in personal doership and attachment to outcomes. And if we see that our attachment to outcomes is an attachment to love, an attachment to being better than everyone else, then we might see that the guilt and blame and pride is based on seeing myself as the one that is in control of how I turn out, and seeing the other as the one in control of how they turn out, and then attributing or using that attitude of personal doership and saying you should have been different. I should have been different. And so this narrative, of which there are infinite variations that are more or less continuous from the moment we wake up to the moment we go to sleep, and even in our dreams, will probably pervade with a similar theme in our dreams. That narrative, which is a narrative about who I am and what this situation means about me, is continuous, simultaneous to the circumstance. And we have no idea that it can be different. And in some of the awakening moments, the sense of self, the personal sense of self, is rendered ineffective, as if it has dissolved in the moment. And then life is suddenly known differently. And the knower of life is different. And the experience of life, the beingness in life, who I am and how it feels, is different. And why sometimes, the contrast can just be so significant that we might feel like it's bliss. But really, it's not bliss, it's peace. But relative to all the noise and the uncomfortableness, we might go, this is bliss. It might feel like such a relief that it feels like something, whereas actually it's the falling away of the uncomfortableness into quietness. And if that quietness persists for an ongoing basis and it becomes your norm, then the sense of bliss, the sense of relief falls away. It becomes normalized. But if you contrast it next to, it's like being in a room where there's a jackhammer outside and it's there for your whole life, and then suddenly it stops. And you say, oh my God, what a relief, what bliss. And the contrast between the two will feel like a feeling. And after 3 years of no jackhammer outside, you might start to forget what the jackhammer was like. And now that's normal. And the bliss falls away. But if you can keep appreciating that the alternative is the jackhammer, then an appreciation, even when it becomes normalized, an appreciation of the quiet relative to or compared to the noise means that we don't take it for granted. Now, in the example here, I'm using a physical noise versus the absence of the physical noise. And that's just a metaphor for the presence of the uncomfortableness with oneself that can fall away. And the falling away of the suffering is peace of mind. And that peace of mind is really the falling away of an attitude towards life. And so it is for this reason that continuous unbroken peace of mind is available in life. If life, which put that psychological identity in place, dissolves the psychological identity, it means life has taken the noise, taken away the component that creates all the uncomfortable noise. And now there is still the rest of the person is left, but without the component that was creating all the uncomfortable noise. So the person now, without that other component, understands that in the next moment, life is going to be a mix of either pleasure or pain. It's going to be something. We don't know what it's going to be. And it's not so important. What we need to do is our best in this moment, understanding that our best in this moment is part of destiny, part of what is unfolding. Our capacity to do something and get a good result is limited. It's not in our control. So we function, and then an outcome happens. And so if our attitude has changed to this, then being worried about the future, being concerned about whether our actions turn into positive or negative outcomes, falls away, because there is an understanding that that's life doing all of that. And so it's going to turn out one way. And this relaxation is by and large because that identity that felt like it needed outcomes in order to be complete has fallen away. And so there is a resting in our own nature that knows that it is already complete and that the unfolding of life is superfluous to our sense of completion. It's not superfluous to life. Life has to unfold. So there is a real difference between circumstances. So it's not that we say, oh, I don't care, someone can come and chop my finger off. No, I'd much rather that that didn't happen, because on the level of pleasure or pain, it is going to make a difference. But attitudinally, we'll leave the pleasure or pain, the circumstance to unfold as it's destined to unfold. If I have an attitude of worry and expectation, what we can start to see is that worry and expectation doesn't actually prevent life from unfolding according to factors out of our control. And having an attitude of regret in the past doesn't change the past. It doesn't make our movement into the future any more successful. All it does is fill the present moment with an uncomfortableness of regret. And all of this needs to be seen. So I'm talking a lot, I always talk a lot, they're just descriptions. They're descriptions of dynamics, the dynamics that are part of the unfolding of the flow of life, dynamics that are part of our attitude to the flow of life. They're really just descriptions. And hopefully in a talk, something is said that clicks, something that wasn't understood or thought about previously or seen previously. And then hopefully over the next days, weeks, months, there's a thinking, a contemplating of it, a seeing the dynamic that has always been there in your life, but that has been unnoticed until life delivered a description of it. The description clicked in one's intellect, and attention and awareness started to land on that dynamic. So as an example, the description is that we will feel pleasure according to our biological preferences and the circumstance that we find ourselves in. If the circumstance is in line with our biological preference, then that is pleasure. If the circumstance is not in line with our biological preferences, it will be registered as pain. The flow of life, circumstance, is always unfolding according to destiny, unfolding largely outside of our control because of factors that we didn't put in place, including our own involvement in life, our own actions and reactions and the consequences, all based on our genes and up-to-date conditioning that I didn't control, based on the genes and up-to-date conditioning of the other, which I didn't control and they didn't control. So we can start to see life as this movement unfolding, and the flow of life is always pleasure or pain. And pleasure or pain is dependent on our biological preferences. Our happiness is not determined by the amount of pleasure or pain in life, but depending on our attitude to the pleasure or pain in life. What is the attitude that delivers unhappiness in life? Unhappiness really is suffering, it's non-acceptance, and it's the attitude of doership, personal doership and attachment to outcome, which forces us to get heavily involved in what is happening, thinking that it's us that can make it change, and thinking that it's essential for us to make it change because that's where we'll find our completeness. So that last 4 minutes was a description. And it's a very important description when it comes to this topic of happiness for the human being and daily living. If that set of dynamics is not seen clearly, we'll keep on pointing in the wrong direction. We'll keep on thinking that our happiness is to be found out there in the future, instead of hopefully finding a stopping happening. A stopping is really, I'm talking about a stopping of that psychological narrative. Just stop. And the stopping isn't something you do. The stopping is like a rolling backward. out of activity, psychological activity. It's just like, stop worrying about the past, it's done. And you can see in so many spiritual traditions, there are always quotes, little quotes, and they hang around because they really are wisdom. So I'll just pick one, the Dalai Lama, and I think it's in AA. There's something about, give me the strength to see the things I can change, the things to accept I can't, the wisdom to discern between the two. So something like that. So it's a saying, and it has wisdom in it. And when we hear them on their own, we go, oh yeah, that's really good. It's great. And it might have an effect on us. It may get us to see some things differently. But very often, independently, when they just drop into our life, they have an effect. They're useful, but they tend to slide back out again. It's like, oh, we'll use that when we need it, instead of starting to see life like that all the time. And so, if we can get a framework that allows us to see life consistently in this way, and then we hear these quotes and we see, oh wow, that's saying this part of the framework. It's when we start to realize that there's real wisdom in the pointings, in coming to see life like this. That there are quotes, wisdom quotes, that will cover every part of the framework. So the stopping is the stopping of the psychological narrative. And it happens when the wisdom inside of us catches the suffering narrative and realizes what it is and sees that it's not helping. It's a habit that takes us further away from where we're really will find solace in life. And so it comes up and it says, stop. So we'll take a few questions. Hi, Holger.
Hello, Roger. Thank you very much. I had a hard time getting up out of the bed this morning. It's here right now, 7 o'clock. And for me, it's so fascinating to be connected with you right now, halfway around the globe. I mean, from California to Australia. It's so fascinating just to think for a moment that this is happening in this moment. Maybe it's just a simulation, I don't know, but for me it feels real. And what came up, yeah, and it's very intimate, this satsang. I mean, the things you speak about, they are normally I mean, you have a beautiful way of opening up, of creating a trust. Because those are normally things we don't allow to see, or we normally don't see because we are so distracted with our false sense of self. And so there is, I just have this feeling, I feel so lonely sometimes, or this idea of intimacy. I mean, to me, this is just our normal state, to be intimate. And I don't really know how to express what I want to say, but isn't our idea of intimacy just a hiding of our false sense of self?
Um, what's coming to me, I didn't invent this, I've heard it before, but intimacy, into me I see, into me I see. Um, and so the intimacy idea we have of being intimate with another may once again be a movement outward. Um, and really, it might be about finding an intimacy with ourself, um, which might require a cutting off of this external craving. But you know, the thing is that um, a loneliness and a craving for companionship and intimacy, um, if it is a form of suffering, which I would suggest that most often is, um, it's it's there, right? It's a result of the psychological entity. It's a human condition, um, and so putting a should or shouldn't onto it, as in, oh, try and stop it or fulfill it. We don't know. Sometimes fulfilling it is what is required to realize it's not what I was really looking for. It felt like it was what I needed. It deeply felt like that's what it is. Um, but it could be that that's coming from a craving where we believe that's what we need, and so therefore we crave it. And often when we get what we crave, that's when we realize in the most meaningful way. That's when we realize it in a meaningful way. Oh, it was never that. I was never really looking for that. That doesn't fulfill. So there is a story I've mentioned of the Zen monk that lived in a monastery, been there for many years, and the head monk could see this Zen monk was very ripe, um, and there was just something that was preventing him from breaking right open. And after many years of observation, the head monk figured it out, and so he organized a surprise, and it took a year or so to get it ready. And when it was ready, he invited this this monk out into the forest, and they walked for a few hours. And once they got to this ridge, um, the head monk presented to this other monk this beautiful abode on the other side of the gorge, carved into the side of the cliff. And as the story goes, it said that the monk in that moment became enlightened. And the moral of the story is that the head monk realized that there was such a craving and desire in this monk that the falling away of the attachment wasn't in him such that he could transcend it just with the practice of renunciation, with the practice of understanding deeply that one's completeness and one's happiness is not going to come from outcomes. So in some situations, we actually need to experience the that which we are craving. Now, it might sound like, you know, the receiving the house gave him so much, and that it was about the material outcome, but really the story is saying it was just that got satisfied, so it could be dropped, because enlightenment, in the sense in the story, is the final collapse of all attachment to outcomes. Um, and so we don't know the mystery of how life is going to undo our attachment to outcome. So we can remain open and honor the feeling of loneliness and where it might drive us, and we might be surprised at how it gets addressed.
I mean, I don't mean the intimacy like on a personal level, but just right now, being in satsang, it's intimate. There is a
Mm-hmm.
vulnerability, there is a sensitivity in this. And I would like to have this with other people too. I mean, isn't this our natural state?
Well, it it can feel very comforting if if we feel very if we feel like something is missing in a way that has made us feel very uncomfortable because of that which is missing. We can crave something, and when we crave something and we get it, it then can feel very good. So, I, you know, I think it's about remaining open to these feelings, because what you'll find is you can be in a place like satsang. It can be very intimate. It can feel like, this is what I've been waiting for, a place of community and intimacy and support. And very quickly, that space can change where the people that at the beginning are being very nice and supportive, then we start seeing the different opinions arise. You start seeing hierarchical structures forming, and then suddenly the very community that is deeply satisfying becomes a new source of challenge to one's sense of self. So there are things in life that are very pleasurable, much more pleasurable than other things, and community and interaction with people are very much a beautiful thing when they are engaged in a healthy way. So yes, I think sangha is intimate, satsang is intimate. We touch places that we're not willing to touch a lot of the time in life. So the whole process is intimate. But let's also be aware of where there could be a part of us that is hurt because we haven't had something and is craving it. And the sooner we start to see maybe that now it's turning into something, it's showing that it is not the answer. At some point it will show this is nice, but it's not the answer. The answer is deeper inside me.
The answer is an openness, a wanting to see what is there. And this to me is the intimacy of satsang. I mean, I don't mean a fuzzy feeling or something.
Yes, indeed.
So it's the willingness, and there I wonder sometimes if I maybe suffer a pseudo openness on my side. Hard to explain, but if am I just fooling myself in wanting to expose things that are actually none of my business?
Well, I think if that's the case, it will become clear. But there's a big risk in remaining guarded. Either way, whether if one remains guarded, it will become exposed. If one is overexposing for sinister strategy or reason, it will become exposed. I think we can trust that one way or another, as our attention and awareness becomes more and more honed and understands really it's an uncomfortableness in its different forms that is what this is all about, a changing of that uncomfortableness, then progress is bound to happen. It is happening, right? Things are
Yes, it is.
Things are being seen.
Yes, it is happening. Yes. Thank you, Roger. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Holger. It's always nice
Thank
to
you.
have you drop.
Thank you.
Hi, Isabel.
Yes, hello.
Hi, Isabel. I can hear you now.
Yes, it's nice to see you, as always.
Good to see you.
I have a question about meditation, but before I just wanted to say something about the reaction of people towards me when often they say, "Wow, there's something in you that has changed," and then I try to explain what has changed, what is the way I feel I have changed, because I really feel peaceful. And then I say, I'm not the doer. And then I realize just some people hate me for hate, maybe is a big word, but people just say so much things then I cannot even receive, because it's going, I'm not Roger, so it's difficult for me to explain as you do. And then I feel a little, in French you would say démuni, not to have the good answer to explain how I feel about that. And so I say, well, I don't know, and then I find it a little short for an explanation. You understand what I mean?
Sure.
It
Yes.
I really have really reaction. You know, I'm part of a group of meditation with John Kabat-Zinn, and during this COVID time, he made meetings every day, and after you would go into Zoom rooms where you can talk with 6-7 people. So it was nice way of meeting people. And one day I was saying what I'm saying, and then there was this veteran guy, and he just went crazy on me. He just went crazy because I was saying I'm not the doer, and then he was trying to explain me, well, if I don't have the choice, blah 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 blah. And then I decided to stop trying to to explain anything about that. But sometimes I feel I would like, and I don't have, I don't know how to do it. I don't know how to explain. I really find so difficult. And I mean, it's great to hear you, because the more I hear you, so sometimes I say, oh yes, maybe I could explain like Roger, but then that never comes. It's weird, because I have this feeling. So
Yes. You see, I think a lot of people don't actually want to hear um, when they ask a question, like, "Oh, you seem so different. What's different?" Um, Maybe they don't really want to hear, especially if you're going to tell them a story about how your life is improved, because it just makes some people feel not so good. Um, so I think even just our experience of seeing, for example, how some people hear what the concept, and they're just not ready to hear it. It's too much of a it's too much of an attack on their sense of self. You know, if someone has been in a very troublesome circumstance and their attitude is very personal, and you describe it from an impersonal point of view, it just doesn't honor their feeling, which I'm not saying their feeling is correct, but it's an explanation of why they will feel so they won't be in agreement with it. And so as this happens, we learn from it, and then we learn how to answer the question. And it might not be, you know, we learn not necessarily to not answer the question, but we can put it in a maybe a softer form. You say, oh, you know, I don't know. I just find I'm taking life much less personally nowadays, and that might be more palatable for people, and they might say, oh yeah, I wish I could take life less personally. And it's amazing. It just started to happen, and it's a big change, and that might be enough, and then you can see if they come back with more interest, then it's like, oh, okay, maybe we can give them some more. But often, if we give too much in one go and they're not interested, then it doesn't land. So I mean, I've learnt this, from with family and friends, and I felt like everyone needed to hear this. When I was seeking 15, 20 years ago, I was always talking to anyone I came across, work colleagues, friends, and started to realize quite quickly that no, these conversations are not to be had with just everyone. It's just not going to be received the way that we see it, because it makes sense. We've been thinking about something for 3 years or 3 months, whatever it is, and all these nuances and changes, and we think, oh, I can just say it and they're going to understand it. But they haven't been thinking and little things changing. So in fact, we can go in and go, there's no way they're going to understand it, even though it sounds simple. When we see how many little tweaks and turns have happened in our thinking for us to understand it, then we go, it doesn't matter what I say in this 2 minutes, they're not going to understand it, because the changes that happened to me haven't happened in them.
Yes, because then after I realize maybe there's a way sometimes people can feel I'm not humble enough with what I'm saying. So I really have to be careful, I think, with that. Not being humble or not, but not. Sometimes maybe I think I make affirmation about my way, and it's just too much. Yeah, I think it's just too much. Yes, I think. So I don't know if but sometimes even when I'm not there every day, I listen to your satsang just to be sure I don't miss something about what you say that would put a little more step on my understanding of saying things. It's nice.
Well, definitely, if you're going to, if you're ever going to talk about it, always start off with, it's about, it's about happiness or peace of mind, because then everything you say, like if you say, oh, I see I'm not the doer, then what's that got to do with anything? So it's always, to me, if we're going to have a conversation, it's good to get someone at the beginning of the conversation to come to their experience and say, this is about, everything that's going to be said is about happiness. So then we don't go off in abstract concepts. If the abstract concepts are there, it's how does this relate back to happiness?
Yes.
So I think that's important when we're having these sort of conversations, because for us it's clear it's about happiness in our head. But if we're talking to someone that isn't used to hearing the talks, it's important for us to say, hey, okay, so it's really just about happiness, and happiness means my experience in daily life. And I found my unhappiness was a certain feeling, and I found that feeling can fall away if I start to relate to myself differently. And then, yeah, just keep coming back to happiness in daily life.
I will do that. I have another question, but then I see there are lots of people with their hands up, so maybe I can come tomorrow or another day when I see you, because maybe it will be longer. It's about meditation. So I'll come back.
Well, I've got you here. Ask the question because you didn't get to ask your question.
So my question about meditation, the way I practice is Vipassana, and Vipassana says it's to see how life is really. Is that correct? Maybe I don't have the good words in English. And then
Sure.
I had the other day something that came and say, oh, okay, what are things really? Just basically, you know. So that was that thing arrives and say, okay, I'm always the same thing about seeking something that I don't know what it is. Like we were talking recently about oneness, which is always there somewhere. But then, so I sometimes just practice and say, don't try to understand something. But I'm not like that. I always want to know more. So what are things really?
So it's what is, right? Is what's
Yes.
being spoken about. What is.
Yes. What is?
So if someone says, what is the truth to you? Is there truth? I think one of the most effective answers there, one of the most accurate answers, is truth is what is. Because, the universe is something. Now, even if it's an illusion, it's an illusion in consciousness, let's say. So let's say there is no universe outside of consciousness. Let's say the universe only arises as an appearance inside of consciousness, and consciousness doesn't have any physical body in which it exists. So that is the idealist philosophy or model, and it's also in line with the non-dual. Everything is God. Everything arises in God, is made of God, and there really is nothing other than God. And in that version, God is formless awareness. So there is no physical universe. So what is saying, well, the truth is whatever it is, without me labeling it as this or that. It's without me saying, because we can have, you can have all sorts of explanations about what this is. It could be an arising of consciousness inside the consciousness of the human being that exists in an actual physical world, in a physical universe. It could be the arising of consciousness in the mind of God, and there is no physical universe. And we don't know. And so truth is what is, which means it is what it is. And so what it's pointing at is stop and be. And when we stop and be, we are essentially being one with what is, because we are not turning it into what I think it is, or a part of what is. Because if we say, well, it is this, then we might be leaving out something bigger than just this. And so Vipassana, when they say it is about truth or about seeing life as it is, it means not about knowing life and knowing what is. It's about being, which means the falling away of the labeling of life as this or that, the falling away of the holding on to a philosophy or a model or a way of knowing life that says this is how life is, but rather we just allow life to be as it is. And that then, that is truth. And so you know that in Vipassana, the emphasis is on, witness the breathing happening, witness thoughts arising, witness emotions happening. And at first it's like if there is an itch, just witness the itch. And maybe what is witnessing the itch can be witnessed. And at some point, Ramesh said, Vipassana in its integrated form is if there is an itch, scratch it and witness the scratching of the itch. So in Vipassana, it's actually about just letting everything be as it is without the one meditating, commenting on how it should or shouldn't be, or what this is.
Yes, but then, for example, when you practice other form of meditation, which are, from the little I know, all about breathing. That there are different forms, and they don't say that you are. They are not pointing about seeking the truth. They and so sometimes, for example, when you I don't do it anymore because I cannot. I've chosen Vipassana because if not, it's too complicated. But then sometimes, for example, before I was listening to repeating mantras, and people say it's another way to. I don't know if it's another way, because then they speak about God. And for me, it's like maybe it's a little confused, because when you, for example, when you recite mantras, people say it brings you to a state which would be the same as Vipassana. Is that?
So breathe when there's the different meditations are there essentially for different people, and if a meditation is about focus on the breath, really it's just a way of bringing attention onto something that is consistently there, that is automatic. And if your attention is on the breath, it's taking your attention away from thinking. So it says just keep coming back to the breath. If you find yourself going off in thinking, come back to the breath. So really it is about being with what is. The breath, actually even coming back to the breath then at some point it can fall away. So coming back to the breath is really, in a way, it's a technique built into the meditation to help us drop out of the thinking mind. And the mantra is the same. You focus on the name of God, repeating the name of God. If you're doing that and you keep coming back to your mantra, you can't be thinking about, what life is, and guilt and blame and pride and all of the thinking mind. So it just says come back to your mantra. In Vipassana, it won't necessarily have a technique like that of focusing attention, but it does in a way by saying, be aware of the sensations in the body. So it's focusing awareness onto a broader range of objects, being the different sensations in the body. And as we become more equipped, as that muscle is strengthened, we find that the awareness can open up such that it doesn't require those techniques. And even that's why I say, as we go beyond the practice of Vipassana, you won't say, oh, well, I have to just be aware of the itch, because it's like, you just scratch it. It's a
Yeah,
much better,
yes.
much better.
It's true.
And while you're scratching it, witness the scratching happening as a result of a body-mind organism moving automatically in life. And the thinking mind isn't required, especially the thinking mind that says, oh, I should have not scratched it or whatever. It's like, who
Oh
cares?
yes, that's not the problem. I can scratch and figure it out. It was just. Can I ask what way you are practicing meditation?
Sometimes I go a month without meditating, and often in my seeking process, meditation wasn't a big practice. I would say in 5 years maybe I meditated, I don't know, 50 times for half an hour. um, uh, Except for the walking, when so I found for me meditation was me walking in parks, contemplating the things I was reading, doing investigation of the nature of consciousness. So that was my meditation, where I would be walking and thinking and witnessing the thinking of, I'd say, how does this, how does it make sense that the consciousness of God is functioning through me? Because at that time there was like, let's say, an idea of me and God. And I'd be thinking about it, and then it clicks and says, oh, there isn't me and God. It's like what I'm seeing in life is what God is seeing. And so then my experience becomes known as, that's the same as God's experience. It's not, I wonder what God's experience of me, obviously because God knows everyone's experience, is how we're we go, I wonder what God's experience of me is. And so I might be walking in the park thinking about this, and then it clicks, oh no, God doesn't have an experience of me from outside me, but my experience of me is God's experience of me. And if I'm walking through the park contemplating this, and there is a witnessing of the thinking, and occasionally, my attention will go on ducks, or the people sitting and talking on the bench, and the trees, and so there's a presence with the park, and then maybe go back to the contemplation. And I would go for 2-hour walks, sometimes twice a day, walking round and round the same park, thinking and thinking about whatever I had heard in Satsang that morning or read in the book 10 minutes ago. And later on, at some point, I found meditation was just something I felt like doing a lot of the time, where I just like to sit quietly and turn inwards. But that was something that happened later on. Sitting meditations happened later on, just because I felt like doing them. Like there'd be times during the day when it felt like, if you're really tired, you just want to have a rest. And there was this feeling inside me that started coming up, which was, oh, I really want to meditate. There's not tired, because when I'm tired, I want to sleep, but the feeling to meditate. And it's almost like being hungry and wanting food, and then this feeling would come up that said, meditate, and close my eyes and meditate, and it's effortless, because there's no job to do in meditation. It's just allow everything to be as it is. If there are thoughts, then let them be there, and I'm not interested in it. And it's the easiest activity you can ever perform, because you don't have to do anything. Now, it's not easy when the body is wanting to think and to get up and do things. And so then I don't meditate when that's the case. So I meditate when I have the feeling to meditate.
Yes, I do the same, but then I've put it in my daily life every day, because if not, I think maybe if I don't do it so regularly, I think I feel I need to do that. So I do it. And now I'm experiencing a new thing that is many times in a day, many times in a day, I just stop and begin to breathe. But I just do that, and I experience, I don't know where it is going to lead me, but I don't know. It's like not meditating all day, but I'm wondering if something is going to emerge from doing this anytime. So I'll see.
Let me know. I
Yeah.
hope you were breathing.
Oui?
I said, I hope you were breathing before.
Yes. I'm breathing anyway. So thank you very much, Roger, and hope to see you another time.
Yes, you're very welcome. Hi, Martin.
Hi, Roger. Hi, Roger. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Oh, good. Yes, I do enjoy your satsangs, Roger, because every day you say something that resonates that I can then go and contemplate. And today you're saying, it is pointless, really, trying to teach someone who doesn't want to listen, or I think there's a saying, isn't it? You can't be a prophet in your own country. And if you think of, Jesus of Nazareth, he struggled enormously with people not really understanding what he was saying. And they personal attack. He just said, just love each other. He made the blind to see, the crippled to walk, and they took such an exception to this that they nailed him to a tree. So what chance have I got? That's what I always used to say when I was in business. That's what they did to some people said he was a son of God, and they nailed him to a tree and killed him. And even the Dalai Lama, some of the things he says, people take exception to it. They see it as a personal attack. That he said, like, when we're babies, our mothers love us. And then people say, well, that's not the case for everybody, and he's a silly old fool, doesn't know what he's talking about. They take everything as a personal attack, because they're living in this, as you point out, in this psychological me. So if anybody says anything that's not to their preference or in line with their beliefs, they see it as a personal attack. And this is how fights in pubs start, isn't it? Or even wars start, So, my personal experience is exactly what you say. Trying to talk to my older brother about anything is just pointless. I once bought him a book called The Power of A New Earth by Eckhart Tolle. And one day we were talking. He said, we just see life completely different from each other. And I said, well, yeah, what's wrong with that? It's chalk and cheese. Did you ever read that book I bought you? And he said, which one? I said, A New Earth. I read it. And I said, well, what about the chapter about people complaining with how things are? And he said, well, how do you mean? I said, well, we've just come in from the car, you know, you're complaining about the new traffic lights. The guy who overtook you was driving too fast and dangerously. The Prime Minister was on the radio. You disagree with everything he was saying. The price of petrol, the price of tomatoes, like everything in the last hour and a half, you were just complaining. What do you think of that chapter that can't? And he said, "Oh, you know, we see things differently." I said, "You never read the book, did you?" He said, "No, you just skimmed it." And he said, "Well, what I did read in there was just common sense anyway." You know, it's so. You know, there's just no point, is there? If people don't want to listen, it's pointless. You just cause yourself suffering, really. It's just interesting just to sit there and say, well, whatever they say, just say, well, that's interesting.
Yeah, it becomes understandable, you know, because as he said, or you said, you're chalk and cheese, you're different.
Yeah.
Well, you know, if we were different, we would be the murderer. And so we can just be grateful that we're not the murderer. But really, that's one of the things when we see that we are a result of our genes and up-to-date conditioning, and this has produced us, and slightly different genes and up-to-date conditioning produce, you know, a murderer. And we can be quite humbled and think, well, I could be the murderer, simply by having a few switches and circumstance changed.
Yes.
So then when your brother is different, obviously I'm not implying your brother is anything, you know, he's just different. He too is not the murderer, but he's different. And when we understand the principle, of course we're different, and therefore we're going to see things differently, we're going to feel life differently, and so then it becomes understandable. And once it's understandable, and that becomes that understandability is an understandability towards ourselves as well. If we feel on a particular moment attacked by life, we can go, oh, it's understandable. If, you know, I make a mistake, it's understandable. It's my makeup. And the judgment in life is because this simple point hasn't hit home for us. And so we don't understand why people are different from us.
Yes.
And then we don't understand it. We go around with this narrative that is at the bottom of the narrative really saying, I can't understand why everyone doesn't think like me.
Yeah.
Which when we think about it is really strange. Why would we ever expect people to think like me when they're not me?
Yes.
And this is actually the crux of non-doership, is the realization we're all functioning exactly according to God's will.
Yes.
And so it's like, oh, that's why.
Very. It's very interesting what somebody asked about Tony Robbins. I think it was yesterday or the day before. I can't quite remember. And I just love your explanation of what Tony Robbins. You know, they say, you know, the teacher comes along when you need to be taught, and I just love your analogy of he's trying to get people to choose between three coloured, I think he said watering cans, a grey one, a red one, and a green one. And people are always changing the grey one, choosing the grey one, never the green or the red one. And Tony Robbins is saying, look, sometimes you've got to take a chance and take a risk and choose the red one. And I just thought that was a brilliant explanation. And then I contemplated it when I was walking. I thought what Tony Robbins is just getting people to do is to make the choices, to do the things they want to do, if you see what I mean, rather than doing what they think they should do from their conditioning. Oh no, I couldn't possibly go and buy a bottle of £45 champagne. That's a waste of money. When in point of fact, that may be the right thing to do at the time. Go and buy a £45 bottle of champagne and drink it and enjoy it. makes any sense. But yeah, I you know, 'cause a lot of people say, "Oh, Tony Robbins doesn't understand this, doesn't understand that." He probably does actually understand it. Yeah. I don't know. But I think it was interesting you saying about this wanting more, and suddenly I realised today what I was wanting is to get back what I once had. And I sent you a note about perhaps talking about the book of Job or Job. You know, the guy who lost it all and was, you know, went through the most appalling suffering, and then God gave it all back to him again in double. Yeah, I spend all my time trying to figure out how to get back what I once had.
Right.
Which is crazy. It's totally ridiculous.
Yeah, well, you might be missing what you...
Well, I miss it. But yeah, I miss it. I miss the people. I miss the money. I miss the approbation. I miss the feeling of doing something useful for other people and helping and all those things. It was just a realization today. Yeah, it's just the flow of life. But also I realized I wasn't the doer. All those things literally fell into my lap. It fell into my lap. You know, the good things and the bad things. You know, loved ones dying, losing money, losing businesses, and then something else would come along. You know, I wasn't the doer. Everything fell into my lap, and now you've fallen into my lap. Luckily.
So you should be very grateful, not necessarily for me falling into your lap, but for those things you were given in the past.
Yes.
Like, you know, and instead of, you know, we can, it's just, one way is we feel sorry for what we've lost. The other is, wow, how grateful I am to have had a period of life where those things were there for me to enjoy.
Yes. But there's no reason why I can't enjoy what I got now, really.
That's why I said, you know, the craving for them may actually be preventing you from seeing what you have now.
Sure.
Which, if you compare it, you might always go, oh, you know, it's not as good comparatively. But, you know, the thing is that we take for granted just the standard, the fact we have food, the fact that we're not living under a bridge at night when it's cold, the fact that there are friends that care for us. There's so much in life that we have fresh air, that we have clean water, that yeah, there's just so much that we take for granted, and we're looking at the things we don't have when there's this plethora of things that makes our life completely luxurious, really, in a relative sense. So there's a lot to be thankful for.
There is. Thank you, Roger.
Pleasure,
amazing.
Martin.
Thank you.
Welcome. Hi, Jonas. Or Jonas.
Hi. Hi, Roger. Nice to meet you. Thank you very much for your satsangs. I really enjoy your clarity and patience, and yes, the explanations. And
thank you.
This morning I watched a satsang of you where you were speaking about meeting Ramesh, and something stuck with me there. It was like, it was about this thing that you were saying, at that time you were in a place where you were experiencing yourself as consciousness, and you were clear about that this is what you are, and your way of looking at it was, you are not the human being, and this is exactly what the freedom is. And then when you met Ramesh, he kind of he challenged that very much, or he told you, you're Roger talking to Ramesh. Ramesh is listening to Roger, rather than consciousness speaking and consciousness listening. And that though in the beginning you were kind of resisting that or didn't know what he was about, somehow this was the important thing you needed to hear for as far as I think what resonates with me is because you said otherwise you might have still been now in the place that you have been then, which was quite a good space, but there was kind of a subtle waiting for the final shift or something.
Yes,
and
exactly.
that somehow this way of Ramesh speaking focused you in another way, so that this expectation for the final shift maybe fell away. Or I would like to, I don't know, maybe you can elaborate a bit on that, because something is resonating with me. I don't know if I can put the finger on it exactly, but it's something about how this perspective of, no, you're Roger, you're not consciousness, in a way, how that turned into this epiphany for you, you know what I mean?
Yes, I do. I guess it comes down to, and someone asked me a question today, which I haven't replied to yet, but they said, how is it that Nisargadatta was Ramesh's guru, and yet Ramesh's teaching is so different from his guru's teaching, Nisargadatta's teaching. And it's particularly pertinent to what you're bringing up, because before I met Ramesh, I was immersed in the teachings of Nisargadatta, which created the awakening to the consciousness and to the formless essence, to the fact that all of life is arising inside a field of awareness, and that all the perception, that which feels like time and space and objects, are essentially a creation, simulation within consciousness. And so having gone through that and seen what myself and life radically different, I then found myself at Ramesh's, where he was talking about the person, about causality, about a lot of things that needed to be sort of diminished in order to bring about that shift that I was just talking about. And so I was a bit confused when I went to hear Ramesh, because it seemed like it was missing the point. At least it was missing the point of the earlier teachings. And so the question was, how is it that Ramesh delivered such a different teaching from his guru's teaching, and what was his attitude towards Nisargadatta? Was it one of devotion and love, or was it one of sort of having moved past that? And the answer really lies in the fact that there are different jobs that need to be done. A bit like, I don't know, if you're panel beating a car, you have to knock out all of the dents, and then smooth it all up with a sander, and then paint it. And they're three different jobs. And if you tried getting rid of the dents with the painting techniques, you don't get rid of the dents. And if you try painting the car in the same way as getting rid of the dents, you don't end up getting the car painted. So if we can appreciate that this is a process, it's a like a conveyor belt process, and different things are needed at different times because there are different parts to the job. So what the awakening teachings need to do and do is create essentially a separation within the human being. And it doesn't feel like it's a separation within the human being. And it's not described as a separation within the human being. It's described as coming to realize that everything is happening within consciousness and that there is no human being, that the human being is just an appearance in consciousness. That's what it's described like, and that's what it feels like when it happens, that there is a shift, and the shift in that moment is a realization that the human being is not what it was thought to be. Now, if we are left there, it's sort of like having all the bumps knocked out of the car. You know, it was a crashed up car, and it's now been the dents have been pushed out and hammered out. And let's say they've been hammered out in a really great way. You know, the person that is hammering out the dents has done a great job. And let's even say it's been all filled in and sanded back, and it's beautifully smooth. It's a great job. Now, we can either say it's a great job. We can look at it and say, wow, they've done such a great job of getting rid of the dents and smoothing it all up. But the job isn't finished. That part has been done really well. And I guess this is the thing, is that shift needs to happen in a way. It's needed, but then after that there is a new set of pointers that will say, you know, this is just a new person, a new human being. That experience that you're having of life is a human experience. It's a state of the human that is very much available. And it doesn't feel like a state of the human. It feels like a state where there is no human. So you start off with a state that is the human state, which is what, let's say, is the normal human existence. And then spirituality comes and does its work on that initial human state. And then there is a shift. And the shift is also a human state, but it's a human state that doesn't feel like there is a human. So it feels like it's not a human state. But I'm suggesting it is a human state. And then there is another shift that happens, which is to get us to realize it's a human state, and to ground back into the human that is still there, has always been there. And in doing that, there is a new human state, let's say the third version, which is also a human state, and it's different from human state 2 and human state 1. And so that's where we start off. Then we go on to the second phase, and then this third phase. And you could open up into 10 phases, depending on how narrow you want to break each phase down. And that's what I think happened when I went to see Ramesh, something as a progression on the earlier changes. And there's a lot of people in non-dual seeking nowadays that are having these awakenings because they're exposed to the awakening teachings that are having this effect and creating the non-human, the state that is a human state that feels like it's not a human state. And if they don't come across a teaching that starts to integrate that, then the danger is that it can seem so convincing that the concepts that brought it about get sort of, it's like a feedback loop where we keep confirming those concepts and thinking that the reason the seeking hasn't stopped is because we haven't gone far enough into that non-human state. And so we can keep seeking outward into that more of that non-human state, whereas phase 3 is to come back to what feels like much more of a human state again. And so if in the middle phase where it feels like a state that is not a human state, if we keep heading outward, then we never end up coming back to this more human state. And so Ramesh really said, let's keep it practical, because in the awakened state, it's not practical. Nothing about the way we see life is practical in that state. It's always the big picture view. We become very transcendent. I'm not the body. The details are not important. I'm just consciousness, and that is the truth, and that's the awakening, that's the realization, that's liberation. And, you know, if anyone talks about daily life, it's like, it's just apparent. It's, you know, that's the whole point. You're missing that it's just apparent. And if that delivered a practical contentment for people, that would be fine. We'd say, okay, well, you stay there in that state, and then that would be liberation, because there is there would be a freedom in that. My experience, at least, and I hear it reflected in other people, is that after you've experienced that for long enough, there starts to be a sense, an intuitive sense that something's not quite right, that something is missing. And that sense that something's missing often is what gets us to think we have to go further into the nothing. And I'm suggesting that why that feeling that something is missing is there is because we have to come back from the nothing and acknowledge the person and be the person, but free from the beliefs of personal doership and attachment to outcome, which means in practical terms, what are we looking for? We're looking for a way of being in this life, because we can't punch out of this life. You know, even if we acknowledge it as a illusion or a limited version of reality, when we see that, we don't escape it. So at some point we have to really have this click. Actually, I have to live the rest of my life as a human being. And the funny thing is that there are some people in that awakened state that are human beings that are convinced they're not human beings, which really, when you look at it, is a form of delusion. And I say that with the utmost of respect, of having been in that situation, and only in hindsight, when certain things clicked, did I realize I was deluded. In a good way, in a way, because it's the teachings that came before that set in place, well, at least the way they were interpreted, created the awakening, and they also created the delusion, and life, as it tends to do, delivered a solution to that delusion in the form of a guru that I didn't think was my guru until I landed at his doorstep.
Mm. Mm-hmm. Mm. So, yeah. Okay. Thank you. I have another question, but I don't know it right now concerning this.
think about what I've said, because I think this is an area where specific questions are important, because I don't want it to seem like I'm dismissive. In fact, I hope that what I put forward can be convincing, because I really feel like that's where I was, and it was only very good luck that Ramesh was so practical, which is unusual in the teachings, because there is so much need for the describing life radically differently, because most people haven't had that shift of seeing life radically different. So there's a lot of teaching, doing that job. So given that I've come through that, because I'm not listening to those teachings, not having come through it, and say, oh, they're all nonsense. What I'm trying to say is that they are completely valid. They need to be there. We have to have the utmost of respect for them, because they're a very important part of the process. But let's not take one part of the process and mistake it for the whole thing.
Yes, I think now I can. If I'm sorry, sorry, I interrupted you. I think I can now say what's coming is like the other thing that you said in this satsang that I watched this morning, that was like very, very good to hear, was this simple question that Ramesh used to put forth, like, what are you essentially looking for? And that it is actually peace of mind, and not a more transcendental state necessarily. We just wish for that because we hope that we find a deeper peace of mind there. So, and which is, of course, it's in a way very clear, makes very much sense. And I think this is maybe something that is a bit happening with me, because I experience myself as consciousness, and when suffering seems to happen, it's not, most of the suffering has fallen away, or it's not at all as dense as it used to be, but like little bits are happening here and there, and that seems to be when I mistake myself for a person again. And so the direction seems to be to go deeper into the nothing, as you just said.
Yes.
But then there was something about this what you mentioned that kind of stuck with me, that actually it's about peace of mind. This is what all the seeking is fundamentally about. And yeah,
you'll notice the suffering happens when you come back, but as the doer and the person that is involved. If you come back as a person that isn't involved, which is not saying don't be involved, but as we change, you'll see, oh, actually there's no problem with being a person, as in a human being. There's a problem with being a human being that believes that life has to be a certain way, and I should have done this and I shouldn't have done that, and you should do this and you shouldn't do that. And there's all of this psychological involvement, and we come back, and because when the doership and attachment to outcome is part of the system, as soon as we come back, we find that attitude is there. And so the way that teachings have dealt with that is saying you're not the person. Time and space doesn't exist, causality doesn't exist, which is really saying, all of your narrative of how life should be and shouldn't be is all based on believing life to be a certain way. So the teachings say it's not like that. So stop being involved in being a person and be that which is aware of everything. And so when you look at it, on the one hand, it looks like freedom because it's freedom from the person. But on the other hand, it's it can be a dissociation from what you really are, but in a way, a dissociation. And the trick is that dissociation is very helpful because it's cutting off the habit of continually judging life. If we come back to being formless awareness, it's like when we are resting there, life seems irrelevant, really. It's like it doesn't touch who we are, so I don't need to comment on it. And in not commenting on it, we're essentially weakening that muscle. It's getting less exercise and it's dying. And at some point, hopefully we find ourselves coming in and being able to be a person, and instead of escaping out of the person, we can find ourselves, like, let's say, one part of the person, the working mind, catching out the thinking mind part of the person. And it's that thinking mind part of the person that goes into the judgment, for example, that can get cut off without us having to not be a person. So in really practical terms, it can be like, I hate you for what you did. Why did you do this to me? And then stop. And you're still a person, but you're not in that story of, I hate you and life can't be like this. And so we then see, there's no problem with being a person. It's just that it has to be a person that isn't designed to get fully invested in life.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what the process is doing. The process is really changing the person from a person that is forced to be fully invested in life to eventually a person that isn't invested in the same aspects of life as it was previously.
Yes, that makes sense.
Very good. Feel free to drop in again if you have some more questions you want to discuss.
Thank you. Thank you.